Wait, what? They bombed China? That's not good. Huh? And MacArthur doesn't think they should ever give Taiwan back to China, to Mao's China. Yeah, I don't know if provoking communist China is a good idea. Yeah? They have connections with North Korea. Okay. August 27th, 1950. Douglas MacArthur has a plan that he thinks might win the war. A daring plan to regain the initiative and smash the North Korean forces. But he has to sell it to the rest of the powers that be. Well, this week, he gets them all together and tries just that. I'm Indy Neidel, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the fight continued all around the Pusan perimeter, though the UN forces won the Battle of the Naktong Bulge. Murders of POWs caused outrage in UN command, and the relocation of the South Korean government from Daegu to Pusan caused a lot of worry and fear among the civilians and refugees in the south. On the 21st, as this week gets going, the North Korean 13th Division launches a major attack against the ROK 1st Division on the hills and the US 27th Division in the valley on the Daegu front. The ROK is the South Koreans. The fight here began last week. This valley, the Sangju-Daegu corridor, is given the nickname the Bowling Alley by the US 27th Infantry that night. The enemy T-34 tanks fired armor-piercing shells straight up the road towards the American positions, hoping to knock out the American tanks. The balls of fire hurtling through the night and the reverberations of the gun reports appeared to the men witnessing and listening to the wild scene like bowling balls streaking down an alley towards targets at the other end. Colonel John Michaelis, 27th Infantry Commander, sends a message to 8th Army Command that the ROK 1st Division is not fighting. This charge is very much resented by its commander, General Paik Son-yup. He says, you know what? He'll be happy to hold the valley position with all the armor and artillery 27th has while they go up into the hills and fight night battles each and every night using small arms at close combat. It must not go unnoticed that all the time the 27th Infantry and supporting units were fighting along the road, the ROK 1st Division was fighting in the mountains on either side. Had those ROK troops been driven from this high ground, the perimeter position of the 27th Infantry would have been untenable. The ROK 1st Division must receive a generous share of the credit for holding the front north of Daegu at this time. The night of the 24th is the final night of KPA attacks. That's the North Koreans, here in the bowling alley. And 27th Infantry is ordered to return to the 25th Division around Masan. 1st ROK Division is to assume responsibility for the valley, but will have US 23rd Regiment in support. Hey, here's an odd story. On the 22nd at 10 a.m., Chong Pong-ok, who commands the artillery supporting the North Korean 13th Division, walks up to an ROK 1st Division outpost holding a white flag. He says he was reprimanded for not shelling Tabu Dong. He did not appreciate the reprimand because he believes the terrain prevented such shelling, so he deserted. It's maybe more complicated than that, but that's what I got. Colonel Chong is the highest-ranking prisoner the UN forces have taken so far, and he gives the location of his artillery, and then UN air power and artillery destroy it. I've said before that there's a sort of race against the clock here in Korea, with the North Koreans wanting to finish the job of taking the whole peninsula before the UN can put together the force to drive them back, and the UN wanting to hold off the northern tide until they have enough force to do so. It really seems around now that some sort of equilibrium has been reached, or more like last week. Obviously, the distances involved are a huge disadvantage for the UN forces, bringing stuff from across the Pacific. But it's only 1,000 kilometers or less from the far north of Korea down to Pusan. On the other hand, the KPA supplies are on foot, truck, or train, as opposed to plane or ship. And they are hunted, and their logistics are under constant fire from UN planes. During the entire fight for the perimeter, the UN control of the air is and has been an absolutely vital part of being able to hold out. In the tactical sense, it was probably Marine air support that was most visible. Lightly equipped and organized for amphibious assaults, the Marines lacked the heavy artillery of the Army and had therefore made a specialty of close air support of troops on the ground. The Air Force was quite differently configured, and its tactical support was more of an improvisation, using planes such as the Texan and the Mustang, which had just been relegated to second-line duties. The Marine pilots are also experienced as infantry, so they can often read the battle on the ground better than their Air Force counterparts. The Navy does join the tactical fight to an extent, as does the Australian Air Force. But the Navy and the Air Forces are doing most of the less visible work, going after the KPA supply lines up and down the peninsula. During the fight for the Pusan perimeter, the USAF has been running 40 daily sorties to disrupt KPA logistics. They have destroyed 32 bridges, and the danger they present has ground daytime KPA traffic to a halt. They've also really targeted anything that could be a logistical hub and things like refineries. U.S. naval planes have been hitting transport hubs all the while, so the KPA has not been able to continuously supply itself properly and is by now pretty overextended. However, on the 27th, the 67th Fighter Squadron accidentally hits targets over the border in Chinese territory. Mao Zedong's Communist Chinese government complains to the UN, and Joseph Stalin's USSR draws Security Council attention to that complaint. The Security Council proposes that India and Sweden should form a commission to decide what the US must pay China in compensation. But the Soviets veto this. There's another issue with supplying the South, that of what is available. I don't mean what the US physically has on hand, but what of that can actually go to Korea. They have a lot of other commitments. I mean, sending men and stuff to Korea means they can't send it to Europe, and vice versa. And of course, some stuff they just don't have these days. Equipment inventories had been allowed to run down since 1945, and the ammunition shortage, especially in certain types of artillery shells, became quite critical, because the United States had not only not replenished stocks, it has actually dismantled the entire ammunitions industry after the end of the war. What company wanted to make 105mm shells that no one wanted to buy when the consumer market was clamoring for baby carriages? And once again, there's the troop shortage. Sure, they're mobilizing ever more men in the States and activating reserves and National Guard units, who are super happy about that. And there are all those occupation troops still in Japan. And people are asking, why aren't they being sent over? Theater Commander Douglas MacArthur, though, has the defense of Japan as a prime consideration. I mean, what if Korea is just a prelude or even a sideshow? What if there's about to be a big communist assault against Japan, Taiwan, and Europe? Holding Japan is way more important to American interests than retaking half or taking all of Korea. So he's got to keep a lot of the occupation force in Japan just in case. Korea, right now in August 1950, does have priority. So one thing they're going to do to try to get more men into the fight is Katusa, Korean augmentation to United States Army. That becomes a thing this month. The idea is to take 30 or 40,000 Korean recruits and integrate them into the U.S. Army at like 100 per company or so. Each Korean is to be paired with an American who is to teach him basic fighting skills. No idea how this will go, but considering that the U.S. Army has still not been fully successful integrating black, English-speaking American soldiers into the Army, a Korean buddy system with completely incompatible languages might not work out as well in practice as some think it does on paper. We shall see. There are other reinforcements on the way, though. The British 27th Infantry Brigade has been in Hong Kong since May 1949, beefing up the defenses in case Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist forces should attack. Two of its 3 battalions, that from the Middlesex Regiment and that from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Regiment, are to go to Korea. All 3 battalions were well below war strength, and 3/4 of the officers and men were national service conscripts, many below the age of 19. A constant turnover of national service personnel had severely affected training. Strict economic constraints on ammunition had cut back live firing from mortar and anti-tank detachments. But the rifle companies of all of 27 brigades battalions, hardened by vigorous practice on the hills of Hong Kong, were as fit as they could be for what awaited them in Korea. That may be, but conscripts under 19 are not going. So volunteers make up the difference from the 4 other regiments who have force in Hong Kong. So the brigade is men from a bunch of different units now in the Middlesex and Argyll's battalions. They leave Hong Kong the 25th for Busan aboard carrier Unicorn and cruiser Ceylon with a destroyer escort. The British Joint Chiefs back on the 17th approved this mission, sending 2 battalions and no armor until the 29th Independent Brigade Group can get to Korea from Britain in the future, and then these 2 battalions will return to Hong Kong. Prime Minister Clement Attlee approves this the 23rd. They should arrive in the next day or two. Interesting that a few weeks ago, British Chief of Staff Bill Slim said they were not going to send anyone from Hong Kong or Malaya to Korea. But then again, they are going to return there soon enough. There are plans for the future being furthered this week as well. Developments come this week concerning Douglas MacArthur's plan to make an amphibious landing far in the KPA's rear to completely sabotage their logistics and regain the initiative. It is to be a master stroke, and the plan is to land a couple of divisions at Incheon. Thing is, outside of MacArthur, not many people are sold on the plan, and there's been a fierce debate about its feasibility. On one side were ranged the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the key naval officers in the Far East, and an overwhelming proportion of Army, Marine, and amphibious specialists. For this, it must be recalled, was still the immediate post-war period, when the middle and upper ranks of America's armed forces were still thickly populated with officers who had planned and carried out opposed landings from end to end of the Pacific. These men understood from experience every subtlety of tides, beach gradients, unloading capacity, fire support plans. They examined MacArthur's concept with acute professional care and almost unanimously declared against it. Incheon does have real problems for such an operation. Its tidal range is over 10 meters, one of the 2 largest in the world, meaning that only on 3 dates, September 15th, 27th, and October 11th, is there a 3-hour window where the tide is high enough for the big landing craft to come up to shore. Otherwise, it's just mud and basically impassable. The Flying Fish Channel, which is the approach channel, has a really stiff current as well, which is going to be tough to navigate. And the only way of getting the main landing forces ashore at the seawall is first taking the island that commands the approaches to Incheon. And that can only be done 11 hours in advance, which will pretty clearly telegraph what is about to happen to anyone there who feels like defending the seawall and the shore. Thereafter, the problems became worse. The limited cargo handling facilities, the imminence of the typhoon season, the steep overlooking hills from which a competent enemy could pour a devastating fire onto the beachhead. Finally, the tide times dictated that the main landings must take place at evening, leaving the assault force just 2 hours of daylight in which to gain a secure perimeter ashore in a city of 250,000 people. I don't know if you saw my coverage of the Second World War, but if you did, or if you didn't, go and check it out. Remember Anzio? That's only a few years ago, and everyone here remembers it. That was 2 divisions landed, but not only were they there for 4.5 months before their breakout occurred, that breakout only happened because the rest of the army advanced to where they could catch up with the beachhead, and there were by then up to 150,000 people in the perimeter. And Incheon is only going to be 1 Marine and 1 infantry division. So yeah, there are plenty of people thinking this is going to be another invasion army stranded on beaches under fire for endless weeks. And what if they instead commit 2 more divisions to 8th Army at Busan? Wouldn't that make a breakout from the Busan perimeter more likely and more doable? The easy way? Also, Marine General Lem Shepard, commander of the Fleet Marine Force, thinks the Incheon scheme might well fail because he figures the North Koreans will have the same sort of fanatical fight-to-the-death defenses the Japanese had on Iwo Jima 5 years ago. Well, on the other side of the argument is Douglas MacArthur. He does not agree with just reinforcing Busan. He, as well as anyone, understands how poor 8th Army morale has been, and throwing in more troops there might well just make a bigger meat-grinding stalemate. This week, on the 23rd, comes a meeting. No, the meeting. A lot of bigwigs meeting this day. Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins, Naval Operations Chief Forrest Sherman have come from Washington. Shepard is there, 7th Fleet Commander Arthur Struble, and Amphibious Group 1 Commander Jim Doyle, Far East Air Forces Commander George Stratemeyer, Arthur Redford, heavy hitters. Although one guy who is not there is Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg. The Marines, whose job it would be to lead the landings if Incheon were approved, were not invited to the meeting, their own questions and doubts never to be raised, which became something of a sore point. During the meeting, Admiral Doyle and his men briefed the assembled brass in painstaking detail for almost an hour and a half, about every technical and military aspect of the landing. Then Doyle himself got up. "General," he said, "I have not been asked, and I have not volunteered my opinion about this landing. If I were asked, however, the best I can say is that Incheon is not impossible." Then MacArthur has his say. He gets really theatrical. He's very good at that, too, praising the Navy and expressing his lifelong admiration for it, especially for bringing the U.S. back from the humiliation of Bataan in World War II. To Doyle's chagrin, this actually wins over Sherman's support for the operation. MacArthur talks for 45 minutes after the briefing, explaining why he has chosen Incheon. First of all, landing in the south at Kunsan would be an envelopment that doesn't envelop and place more troops in danger right near all the others in the perimeter. And since Incheon is so well defended, the KPA is absolutely not going to expect an attack there. And taking a major KPA strongpoint would really cut off their supply and communications. A game-winning masterstroke victory here would also avoid a harsh winter campaign. Okay, he has not yet won the day, and a lot of guys leave the room still unconvinced. We'll likely know in a day or two what the Joint Chiefs and the President's final verdict is, but this may well be a turning point, and MacArthur continues with the planning the rest of the week. There's something else this week that concerns MacArthur, though. Remember back on August 6th, when Mac met with U.S. President Harry Truman's representative, Averell Harriman, about the China situation, and Harriman left that meeting not convinced that Mac was on board with the need to avoid war with China, avoid trouble over Taiwan, and maintain UN unity. MacArthur, if you'll remember, was against the ban on Chiang Kai-shek bombing mainland China from Taiwan. Well, turns out Harriman was right. See, MacArthur writes to the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, who happen to be pretty hawkish about China. It's a speech that he writes for them to read at their annual meeting, and it's about Taiwan's strategic importance, and criticizes those who argue that defending it might alienate Asia. He feels that such people did not understand Oriental psychology. This was a sideways blow at Atchison and his policy towards Chiang in the pre-Korea period. The letter was doubly embarrassing because it appeared on the eve of a UN debate on Taiwan, in which the UN denied any intention of establishing a special position on the island. MacArthur was expressing its strategic value to the U.S. defense perimeter, implying the permanent denial of the Cairo Declaration of 1943, pledging the island to China. This all comes out on the 26th. Truman is furious. It's too late to prevent its publication, but it hasn't been read at the VFW convention yet. Truman tells his Defense Secretary Lewis Johnson to have MacArthur withdraw the speech. Johnson hesitates in doing this, though, trying to come up with ways to maybe soften the speech or something. Finally, Truman calls Johnson and dictates, "The President of the United States directs that you withdraw your message for the national encampment of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, because various features with respect to Formosa are in conflict with the policy of the U.S. and its position in the UN." Taiwan is Formosa. I'm going to look into the future just so I don't forget to mention it later on because it's important, but Johnson is actually fired over this a couple of weeks from now. Yeah, fired. Okay, he's been sort of on the outs with Truman lately anyhow, but this is the last straw, it seems. George Marshall will replace him. You'll no doubt remember Marshall from my World War II broadcasts when he was U.S. Army Chief of Staff. He was actually Atchison's predecessor as Secretary of State, and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe is named after him, of course. Johnson out and Marshall in happens 3 weeks from now. Truman also considered removing MacArthur from his command in Korea and Taiwan and restricting his authority to Japan. He had no doubt the general was playing a political role, appealing to the Republicans in the hope of reversing global strategic priorities and improving his own chances of the Republican nomination in 1952. In the end, however, the president failed to act. With controversial new commitments to NATO under consideration, he could not afford the Republican storm, which would be provoked by the demotion of MacArthur. Nor, on military grounds, did he wish to risk replacing his commander in Korea at a crucial stage of the war. And now, back to that war. Last week, the North Korean 12th Division was pushed out of the Pohangdong-Gigya area in the east near the coast. And that was pretty good for UN forces morale. On the 26th of August, American and ROK officers in the Pohangdong-Gigya area, with great optimism, congratulated each other on having repulsed what they thought was the last serious threat to the Pusan perimeter. In their view, the North Koreans were now on the defensive, and the war might end by Thanksgiving. Well, they are wrong, because not only is the KPA planning a massive offensive along the whole perimeter to go off next week, but today, the 27th, the North Korean 12th Division hits the ROK Capital Division north of Gigya. The entire division is pushed back, and Gigya falls. U.S. 8th Army Commander Walton Walker is understandably worried, but I have a feeling he'll be even more worried in a few days when the next big KPA attacks go off. But that I shall speak of next week. For this week is over. A week of planning, a week of sending in troops, and a week of fighting in the center and the east of the Pusan perimeter. Oh, and a week of demonstrations of UN aerial supremacy, but all weeks are such weeks at this point. Without complete control of the air and seas over and around Korea, the UN forces would have lost this war already. But there are limits. Airstrikes hit the KPA supply lines, but they don't only use the roads, and they bring up plenty of supplies through the broken countryside. They move by night, and they're getting ever better at camouflage. T.R. Fehrenbach writes in This Kind of War, while air power and sea power were absolutely vital for American hopes of success, this was to be a ground war by the enemy's choice. A French minister of state, in the days when Bourbon France was the land power par excellence of the world, once respectfully pointed out to his government that if France seriously intended to challenge Britain, a sea power, she must first have a navy. 200 years later, the United States was in the same position. If it seriously desired to check the communist advance on the ground, the United States would have to take on the mud, too. Well, the war on the ground looks like it will go into overdrive once again next week. And I shall be there to cover it thanks to the Time Ghost Army. The Army is what makes this possible. You too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest officers in the Army, and Brian Rock. Yeah, Brian Rock is the Army member of the week. I just want to say that again. Brian Rock.
You rock.
Brian rocks, right?
Yes.
Brian Rock. All the little kids with the crimson lips go, Brian rocks. Brian rocks. Living in sin with the safety pin going, Brian rocks. Brian rocks. Brian rocks. Brian rocks. And hey, if you want to go back in time and see the real beginning of the airline industry, then click here for a classic Between Two Wars episode from 1919. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.